She only meant to hide behind the shelves, until she walked straight into Keanu Reeves. Frozen with fear, she expected awkward silence. Instead, what he said next unlocked the voice she'd spent her whole life trying to find. And what happened after that, she never saw it coming. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The rain had started early that morning in Seattle, turning the city into a slow-moving watercolor. Emily Carter, 27, walked with her hood up, earbuds in, not because she was listening to music, but because silence, contained in a gentle hum, felt safer than the world around her. Her shoes splashed lightly against the sidewalk as she stepped into the only place she considered sanctuary, Page and Spine, a small independent bookstore tucked between a laundromat and a vegan bakery. She wasn't there to shop, not really, just to breathe. To be around books was to be around voices that didn't demand anything of her, voices she could read on her own terms. In her oversized canvas bag, worn soft from years of use, sat a spiral notebook she never left home without. Its pages were filled with messy lines, scratched-out beginnings, and whispered pieces of a novel she hadn't yet found the courage to believe in. She drifted toward the back, where the poetry shelves lived. The soft lighting and quiet aisles let her breathe a little deeper. She reached out, gently tracing the spine of a book she'd read a dozen times, one that had once helped her survive a panic attack in college. And then it happened. Turning to head toward the fiction section, she rounded a corner and bumped into someone. The impact was gentle, just shoulder to shoulder, but it jarred her completely. Her chest tightened. Her words caught somewhere between her throat and her tongue. "I'm so sorry," she mumbled, stepping back quickly, already halfway to turning and bolting out the door. The man turned to her with a soft expression. "Are you okay?" he asked. His voice was low, calm, the kind of voice you'd expect from someone unshaken by chaos. Emily nodded. It was all she could do. She didn't look at him directly. Eye contact felt like too much. Her heart was thudding, her palms were damp. And then, as she clutched her bag tighter, he noticed the fraying edges of the notebook clutched in her hand. "That looks well loved," he said, nodding toward it. She looked down, blinking. The spiral ring had started unraveling, and the cover was faded from rain and time. She gave a small, nervous nod, hoping the moment would end soon, but not wanting it to either. There was something oddly safe in his tone. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't staring, he wasn't laughing. He was just there. What she didn't know, what she couldn't yet guess, was that this single awkward moment in the back aisle of a Seattle bookstore would be the catalyst for a conversation, a cup of coffee, and a path she never imagined she'd walk. And it all began with a bump. Keanu didn't move away. He stayed exactly where he was, giving her space without making her feel abandoned. It was a rare kind of stillness, not the kind that made you feel watched, but the kind that made you feel safe enough to exist. Emily glanced up briefly, just long enough to confirm it really was him, Keanu Reeves. She had seen his movies, of course, everyone had, but this wasn't the version from red carpets or action scenes. This man wore a navy beanie, a black coat that had seen years of rain, and soft lines under his eyes that said he knew something about quiet days and being alone. "You're a writer?" he asked gently, nodding again toward the notebook. She hesitated. The word felt heavy, like a title she hadn't earned. I try," she whispered. Keanu gave a small smile, not the polite kind people give when they don't know what to say, but the warm kind that reaches the eyes. "That's the best kind," he said. Emily blinked. The tension in her shoulders eased by a fraction. She wasn't sure why, but those words, simple as they were, landed with weight. He didn't ask what she was writing, didn't probe. He just stood there, like someone who had once needed a quiet aisle too. The bookstore hum continued around them. A man coughed near the register. Rain tapped against the front window like a ticking clock, but here, in this little corner by the poetry section, time slowed. Keanu reached for a book off the shelf, a worn paperback, one of Rainer Maria Rilke's collections. He thumbed through a few pages, then paused and held it out. "There's this line I think about sometimes," he said. "Would you like to hear it?" Emily nodded, though her throat was still tight. He turned the book toward her, finger under the words. "Let everything happen to you. Beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final." She felt her eyes sting unexpectedly. He closed the book gently, like he was tucking away something sacred. "I don't always know what to say to people," he said, "but I know what it's like to feel invisible in a room." She looked at him, then fully, not at the actor, not at the name, at the man who'd spoken those words, as if he meant them, as if he'd lived them. For a moment, Emily forgot to be afraid. Not because the fear was gone, but because someone had looked at her, not through her, and said something that mattered. A beat passed, then two. She spoke again, just one word. "Thank you." He didn't answer right away. He just nodded, slowly, like someone who'd been waiting for that word all day. Keanu glanced toward the front of the store, then back at her. "Can I get you a coffee?" he asked. Not like a celebrity making a gesture, but like a person offering warmth on a rainy day. Emily's first instinct was to refuse, not out of rudeness, but because she didn't know how to say yes. She didn't want to be a burden. But then she looked at her own trembling hands, still wrapped around the edges of her notebook, and she realized she didn't want to leave the moment either. "Sure," she said softly. They walked together in silence to the small cafe at the back of the bookstore. A few people looked up, doing double takes when they saw who was with her, but Keanu didn't seem fazed. He ordered 2 drinks, 1 hot chocolate, 1 tea, and let her pick which was hers. She chose the hot chocolate. He smiled, as if he'd guessed right. They sat at a corner table by the window. He didn't fill the space with stories about Hollywood or roles. Instead, he asked simple things. What kind of stories did she like? Did she write at night or in the morning? What made her start writing? Emily answered slowly, word by word, building trust like stacking stones. When she said, "Sometimes I think no one will ever read what I write," Keanu didn't try to correct her. He just said, "I used to think that too." And then, just like that, the conversation became a mirror. In that tiny bookstore cafe, surrounded by books and the smell of rain and coffee beans, a woman who usually avoided eye contact was seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. Keanu didn't give her advice. He didn't tell her to be stronger or braver. He didn't tell her to put herself out there. He just listened. And in the pauses between sentences, in the gentle way he nodded or looked out the window before responding, she found something she didn't know she was looking for. Presence. When they parted an hour later, he pressed his hand lightly to the notebook and said, "Keep going. You already have something most people never find." She clutched it to her chest like a gift. And as the door chimed behind him and he stepped into the soft mist of the Seattle rain, Emily Carter stood quietly, watching the man who had somehow just rewritten the opening chapter of her life. Emily followed Keanu in a daze, her footsteps light but unsteady. The bookstore's soft lighting danced across the polished wooden floor, each step echoing louder in her mind than in the quiet space around them. She still hadn't fully processed what had just happened. She had bumped into Keanu Reeves, and instead of brushing it off or walking away, he had stayed, asked if she was okay, noticed her notebook, and now, inexplicably, he was walking with her toward the front counter. She clutched the notebook tighter, its corners frayed from years of quiet scribbling. That notebook held more of her than most people in her life ever would. The idea that someone else, let alone him, had even acknowledged it was enough to make her legs feel like paper. At the register, Keanu selected a slim novel from the front display, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. Then, without a word, He gently took the worn copy of Letters to a Young Poet from Emily's hands and placed both on the counter. The cashier blinked, surprised, but didn't ask questions. "And add hers, too," Keanu said. Emily's eyes widened. "Oh, no, you don't have to." He glanced at her with a kind smile. "It's already done." She tried to protest again, but her voice failed her. A lump had formed in her throat, and all she could manage was a quiet, breathy, "Thank you." He handed her the freshly bagged books along with a gentle nod. "I've always believed books find us," he said, looking down at her notebook again. "And sometimes they remind us who we are." The words hit her harder than she expected. She swallowed, clutching the paper bag like a lifeline. Keanu stepped to the side and held open the door. The rain outside had slowed to a soft drizzle, mist rising off the sidewalk like steam. "There's a little cafe next door," he said. "If you've got a few minutes, I'd love to hear what you're writing." Emily froze. Her instinct screamed no. Her stomach tightened at the thought of sitting at a table, face to face, with someone, anyone, let alone him. She glanced down at her notebook again. She had written entire lives in its pages, but shared almost none of them. Keanu's voice had no pressure, no demand. It was an offering. Her pulse pounded. She felt herself starting to shake. Then, quietly, she nodded. The cafe smelled like cardamom and rain. A bell chimed softly as they stepped inside, and Keanu gently shook the moisture from his jacket. Emily hovered behind him, her arms clutched tight around her bag, the notebook now tucked securely between her books and her ribs. He chose a quiet corner booth near the window, away from the handful of patrons. The fogged-up glass offered a blurred view of the street, as if shielding them from the world outside. "Sit anywhere you like," he said. She slipped into the seat across from him, spine rigid. Her eyes darted to the exit once, then to the laminated menu in front of her, not really reading it. He didn't rush her. He didn't fill the silence. He simply looked around the cafe as if it were a cathedral, taking in every sound, every cup clink, every raindrop tapping against the glass. After a few moments, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a pair of reading glasses. "You mind if I read while we wait?" She shook her head. He opened the book he'd bought, Letters to a Young Poet, and turned to the first page. The rain outside whispered, and the world around them softened. The waitress came by, recognized him, did a double take, and then, remarkably, just smiled and asked what they'd like. Keanu ordered a chamomile tea. Emily's mouth went dry and she could barely speak. He turned to her gently. "You like tea?" She nodded, unsure which one. "Chamomile okay?" She nodded again. The waitress gave her a warm smile and left. Keanu turned his attention back to the book, but only for a moment. Then, slowly, he said, "When I was younger, I used to come to bookstores like that one just to breathe. I didn't have much to say to people, but stories? I could sit with those for hours." His words weren't probing, they were just there, like stepping stones across a stream. Emily looked down at the notebook on her lap, her fingers twitching along its edge. She didn't know what compelled her, but she opened it slowly, then rotated it so the writing faced him and slid it across the table. He didn't take it right away. He looked at her first, really looked at her, and gave the smallest nod of permission, like he understood this was more than just a journal. It was trust. He opened the notebook carefully. The first page held a short passage, handwritten in tight, neat cursive. "People say silence is empty, but I think it holds more than words ever could." Keanu smiled. His eyes softened, and then he began to read. The silence in the booth felt different now. It wasn't fear or awkwardness. It was something gentler. Keanu read slowly, as if savoring each line. Every few pages, he would pause, glance up, and offer a quiet nod, a wordless kind of praise that made Emily's heart thump so hard she thought he might hear it. He lingered on a piece titled, "To the Ones Who See and Keep Walking." It was raw, just a few lines, but it spoke of being overlooked in rooms, of shrinking so others could stretch, of feeling like an extra in her own life. When he finished that one, he closed the notebook softly and set his hand flat on it. "That," he said quietly, "is honest. And rare." Emily's throat tightened. He leaned back a little. "Can I tell you something?" She nodded. "I used to think being invisible was safe, that if I kept my head down, life would pass over me. But it doesn't. It passes through us anyway. The difference is, if we stay hidden, we miss the parts that make it beautiful." She looked at him, finally meeting his eyes. They were kind, but not pitying. They carried their own shadows, their own weight. "You're not invisible," he said. "You've got a voice, even when you whisper it on paper." A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. She turned her head quickly, wiping it away, embarrassed. But Keanu didn't flinch. He just lifted his cup of tea, clinked it gently against hers, and said, "To being seen, even when it's hard." She lifted hers in return. It was the smallest toast in the world, but to her it felt like the first breath after years underwater. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was shrinking. She felt like she was arriving. The rain hadn't let up. It danced gently against the windows of the small cafe like fingertips tapping glass, soft enough to soothe but steady enough to fill the silence between them. The cafe smelled of cinnamon, steamed milk, and freshly baked pastries. A gentle hum of conversation floated from distant tables, but at their little corner near the window, the world felt paused. Emily sat across from Keanu Reeves in disbelief. She hadn't meant to sit. She hadn't meant to stay. She hadn't meant to bump into anyone, let alone him. Yet here she was, hands wrapped tightly around a mug of chamomile tea, like it was the only thing tethering her to the moment. Keanu, opposite her, stirred his coffee slowly, one hand around the warm ceramic, the other resting on the table, relaxed. He hadn't said much since they sat down, and oddly, that helped. Most people would have tried to fill the silence. He didn't. He just let it be. Emily shifted in her seat, feeling the tightness in her chest begin to loosen. She glanced up at him briefly, but dropped her eyes just as quickly. Her voice came out small, like someone speaking into the wind. "I don't talk to people." Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't respond right away either. He sipped his coffee, nodded slowly, and finally said, "Me neither. Not really." That made her blink. She looked at him again, a bit longer this time. "But you're you," she said, almost a protest. He gave a small smile, the kind that didn't rise all the way to the eyes. "That doesn't make me less alone." His voice was calm, gentle, like water smoothing over stone. Emily stared into her tea. Her fingers loosened just a little on the mug. "I'm always quiet, even when I have something to say. I just don't know how to say it right." Keanu nodded again. "Sometimes it's not about finding the right words. Sometimes it's about being okay with not saying anything at all." They sat in stillness after that, not awkward but peaceful. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, Emily wasn't rushing to fill the silence or make an excuse to leave. She let the quiet wrap around her like a blanket. Outside, someone walked by with an umbrella, and for a moment, all she could hear was the rain and her own heartbeat. Then, softly, almost like breathing, she said, "Sometimes I feel invisible." Keanu looked at her, not startled, not pitying, just there, present. "I know that feeling," he said gently. And with those 4 words, something cracked open in her that she didn't even realize she'd been holding shut. Emily glanced back down at her notebook resting beside her tea. The corners were worn, the pages dog-eared, some smudged with ink where her hand had hesitated or pressed too long. It was the one thing she always carried, even when she couldn't carry herself. Keanu noticed it too. "You write in that every day?" She gave a small nod. "I try. It's easier than talking." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table, not intrusively but openly. "What do you write?" Emily hesitated. "Thoughts, pieces of stories, feelings. I don't know where to put. That's a powerful thing, he said quietly, giving those feelings a place to live. She blinked. No one had ever described it like that before. Most people just told her she should journal, as if it were a self-help tactic instead of a lifeline. Keanu sat back, taking another sip of coffee. You know, when I was younger, I felt like I had to be interesting to be seen. But what I really wanted was to be understood. Emily's breath caught slightly. That's exactly it. He smiled faintly. There's a difference between being watched and being seen. One is noise, the other is connection. She sat with those words, letting them settle in the spaces her anxiety used to occupy. The room felt quieter now, like even the background music had softened to make space for something more important. I never thought I'd meet someone like you, she whispered, still unsure if she meant it as a compliment or a confession. Keanu tilted his head gently. Someone like me? Someone who makes the world feel lighter, she said, just by being real. He looked out the window for a moment, as if weighing that statement against everything he'd lived. Then he turned back to her and said, some of the heaviest things I've carried weren't even mine, just the weight of being someone people expect something from. That struck her like a chord she didn't know had always been playing. I think that's why I write, she admitted, to leave something behind that's mine, not something anyone expects. He nodded slowly, and if it's written with truth, even if only one person reads it, it matters. She stared at him, her throat tightening. I'm scared no one ever will. Then let's start with two, he said, tapping the cover of her notebook gently. You and me. For the first time since they sat down, she smiled, and it wasn't small. It was cautious, unsure, but real, and it stayed. The rain outside softened into a hush, tapping against the cafe windows like an old rhythm both of them knew by heart. Emily shifted in her seat, her shoulders a little less tense, her voice a little less hidden. I never let people read what I write, she said, not even my family. I'm afraid it'll sound stupid. Keanu leaned back gently. Sometimes the bravest thing we do is let someone else hear our voice, even if it's written. Her eyes met his for a second longer this time. Have you ever written anything? He gave a soft chuckle. I have. Mostly personal thoughts, sometimes poems. I burn most of them. They helped when I wrote them, but I never needed anyone else to fix them. I just needed to say them to myself. Emily absorbed that, slowly. So, maybe it's not about being published? He shook his head kindly. No, but it is about being honest, whether to the world or just to yourself. Silence returned, not heavy or awkward, but companionable. The kind of silence that happens when two people aren't performing anymore, just existing, just being. Then, as if the moment called for something lighter, Keanu pointed to her cup. Still warm? She touched it. Barely. Let's fix that. He stood, motioning to the barista. She protested at first, flustered, but he simply waved it off with a smile and paid again. When he returned, she was smiling too. That second sip of tea was warmer than the first, not just in temperature but in something else. Something she couldn't name yet. Before they left the cafe, Keanu took a napkin, pulled out a pen from his coat, and wrote 3 words. He slid it across the table. You are seen. Emily stared at it for a long moment, her chest swelling with something close to gratitude, something even closer to belief. She folded the napkin carefully and placed it between the pages of her notebook. I think, she said softly, this might end up in a story one day. Keanu smiled. I hope it does. Then he stood, offering her a gentle nod. Thank you for the conversation, Emily. She looked at him, not the actor, not the myth, not the face on a poster, but the man who listened. Thank you, she replied, and this time her voice didn't shake. Emily sat with the notebook on her lap, fingers hovering like they might catch fire if they touched the pages too long. It was the same notebook she'd been carrying for almost 3 years. Creased at the corners, pages full of stops and starts, poems half erased, and character sketches only she would ever understand. Or so she'd thought. Keanu didn't speak. He simply waited, sipping his coffee with that same stillness she'd first noticed when they bumped into each other. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded answers. It was the kind that made space. After another beat, Emily slowly opened the notebook to a folded page, one that had been dog-eared so many times it no longer folded flat. She turned it toward him, nudged it an inch closer across the table, then pulled her hands back like they weren't sure they were allowed to be there. He looked down and read. It wasn't long. A single paragraph, handwritten in navy blue ink, but every word carried the weight of everything she had never been able to say aloud. It read, "She never spoke in crowds. Her voice got tangled in her own ribs. But she wrote like the stars were whispering in her ear. Every letter a lifeline, every sentence a confession she couldn't make with sound." Keanu didn't blink. He read it again, then again. Then he looked up. "You have a voice," he said. Emily's breath caught. Her hands flew to her mouth as if to trap the emotion before it got out. No one had ever said that to her. Not like that. Not with such clarity. She'd been told she was quiet, told she was shy, even told she had potential, but never this. Never. "You have a voice." Her eyes brimmed. She shook her head slightly, almost as if the words couldn't possibly belong to her. He pointed at the notebook. "This line right here? Like the stars were whispering in her ear." That cracked something open. She glanced down, afraid to meet his eyes. "That's about a girl who only speaks when she's writing," she whispered. Keanu nodded. "That's not fiction." A pause passed between them. Warm, steady. Not dramatic, just honest. Emily managed a small, almost disbelieving smile. "Sometimes I feel like the page is the only place I exist." "You exist everywhere," Keanu said gently. "But I get it. The page listens differently." Her eyes welled again, but this time she didn't look away. She let herself be seen. For the first time in a long time, she didn't want to disappear. Keanu leaned back slightly in his chair, still looking at her notebook as if it were something sacred. Not flashy, not performative, just real. Emily followed his gaze, her hands finally lowering from her face, resting lightly on her knees. She watched him the way someone might watch a sunrise, still afraid to believe it was actually happening. "I used to write too," he said after a long moment. "Journals, mostly. After my sister got sick. After my daughter." He trailed off, not for effect, but because some silences weren't meant to be filled. Emily didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her eyes told him she understood. He tapped the notebook again with one finger, then smiled gently. "You said this girl only speaks when she's writing." She nodded. "Then write like she's listening," he said. "Like there's someone out there who needs her to speak." Emily's eyes blinked fast, trying to hold the emotion in. She looked down at the open page and then slowly closed the notebook, hugging it to her chest like it might disappear if she let go. "Does that ever go away?" she asked softly. "The fear of being too much or not enough?" Keanu shook his head. "Not always, but it changes. It becomes something you carry differently when you know someone saw you and didn't look away." Emily held still, letting those words sink into the parts of her she usually kept hidden. Keanu glanced toward the rain-speckled window. Outside, the street was quiet. A few pedestrians passed by under umbrellas. Inside, the warmth of the bookstore cafe felt cocooned, like time had slowed for just them. He turned back to her. "You don't owe the world a louder version of yourself." Emily looked up. "Just a true one," he added. Her throat tightened again, but this time it was a different kind of ache, not the ache of invisibility, but of recognition. The kind that said, "He really sees me." She picked up her cup and sipped. It had gone lukewarm, but she didn't care. Her notebook still lay between them, closed now but charged with a new kind of power, like a door had opened inside it. Keanu looked at the notebook one last time, then back at her. "When that becomes a book one day," he said, "I'll be the first to buy it." She laughed quietly, a real laugh this time, small but alive. "Deal," she whispered. And for the first time that day, Emily sat up a little straighter. The conversation drifted into a gentle rhythm after that. Emily asked a few hesitant questions, not about fame or films, but about writing, grief, and silence. Keanu answered thoughtfully, sometimes pausing between sentences, giving her space to think and respond. It was the first conversation in years where Emily didn't feel like she had to perform. At one point, he opened the book he had bought, the same one she had planned to buy for herself, and leafed through the pages. "This author writes with a lot of restraint," he said, half to himself. Emily smiled faintly. "That's why I love her. She doesn't try to impress you. She just tells the truth." He looked up at her. "You remind me of that." Her face flushed. She didn't know how to hold a compliment like that. Not from him. Not from anyone. But it felt good. Not loud, not overwhelming, just good. They talked for almost an hour, but time bent around them like the weather outside had wrapped the cafe in soft silence. Eventually, Keanu glanced at his watch and said, "I have to be somewhere soon." Emily's heart sank a little, but she nodded. He pulled out a pen and asked, "May I?" She handed him the notebook without hesitation. He flipped to the back page and wrote something, shielding it slightly as he did. Then he closed the notebook, handed it back, and said, "Only read that when you feel like giving up." She clutched it tightly. He stood, gave her a small bow, and said, "Thanks for sharing space." And just like that, he walked out into the rain. Emily didn't move for several minutes. The air still felt full of everything that had passed between them, quiet truths, unseen pain, and something that felt like possibility. Finally, she opened the notebook. The message was simple. "The world needs your story. Walk through the fear. I believe in you." She stared at the words until they blurred. Then she closed the book, pressed it to her chest, and let a few silent tears fall. Not from sadness, but from something like healing. That night, back in her small apartment, she sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and began typing again. Not out of pressure, not out of need, but out of hope. For the first time, the words didn't fight her. For the first time, she believed someone might want to read them. Somewhere outside her window, the rain had stopped. The city lights reflected softly on the wet pavement, and Emily, quiet, anxious, unseen Emily, kept writing. Not louder, just truer. Emily had always thought she needed to rehearse life like a play. Every interaction, every response, carefully planned. Scripts gave her safety. But here, sitting across from Keanu Reeves, the man she'd only seen on screens, there were no lines, no plan, just two people, letting the silence settle like fog on a quiet street. She sipped her tea, barely aware of the cup warming her hands. He didn't speak, didn't rush, didn't fill the space with polite noise. After a few minutes, her voice came, slow and hushed, like it had to pass through 1,000 locks before it could escape. "I started writing when I was 8. Keanu looked at her, not with curiosity, but with attention, the kind that makes you feel like your words matter before you even say them. "I was bullied a lot," she said. "School felt like a wall I couldn't climb. So I made my own world, one where the quiet girl got to speak." He nodded, not just as acknowledgement, but with understanding. "I started reading poetry when I was around that age. Not because I understood it, but because it felt like someone was naming something I couldn't." Emily blinked. "You read poetry?" "All the time," he said, smiling slightly, "especially when I couldn't explain how I felt." She lowered her eyes. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not real, like I'm watching other people live, but I'm just background." He exhaled softly. "I've felt that too." Her breath caught. "But you're Keanu Reeves." "And you're Emily Carter," he said gently. "That doesn't make my loneliness more valid than yours." She looked at him, startled, as if he'd given her permission to exist. "I used to think something was wrong with me," she said. "The way I panic at small talk, the way I avoid phone calls. I used to wonder if maybe I was just broken." "You're not broken," he said quietly. "You're just tuned differently." That word hung in the air like a bell tone. Soft, resonant, true. Emily held on to those words, tuned differently, as if they were a lifeline. She didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. Instead, she leaned back slightly and let herself breathe. For the first time in months, maybe years, someone had seen her. Past the silence, the stumbles, the cracked armor of avoidance. And not just anyone. A man she had admired from afar, whose characters stood for justice, for stillness, for quiet strength. "You know what writing gave me?" she asked after a long pause. Keanu waited. "It gave me a place to be someone who didn't flinch at the world, someone who could say what she meant without shaking." He nodded. "You gave yourself that." She hesitated. "But it doesn't feel like enough. I've never finished anything. Just pages of stories that go nowhere." Keanu didn't rush to reassure her. He simply said, "I think the fact that you keep writing anyway says more than you think." That landed differently than anything else had, because it didn't feel like pity. It felt like respect. Emily blinked, then laughed softly. "I cry too easily." "There's nothing weak about feeling deeply," he replied. "It just means you're alive." She wiped at her cheek, more surprised by her own laughter than the tears. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make this emotional." Keanu leaned forward. "Please, don't apologize for being human." That line, that simple truth, slipped through every wall she had built. "I always thought if I just worked hard enough at pretending to be normal, people would stop noticing how weird I am," she said. Keanu's expression softened. "Maybe being weird is the most honest thing we can be." Emmeline looked at him, eyes wide, and for the first time that afternoon, she smiled fully. No filter, no hesitation. "I wrote a scene once," she said, "where a girl meets her favorite actor by accident, and he changes her life." Keanu chuckled. "And how did he do that?" Emily glanced at her notebook. "He didn't try to fix her, he just listened." Keanu smiled, quiet and warm. "Smart guy." There was a pause. No awkwardness in it, only peace. "Can I tell you something?" she asked, almost in a whisper. "Of course." "I didn't think anyone would ever read my words. I didn't think they mattered." He looked directly at her. "They do." Emily's eyes dropped to the table. She gently ran her fingers along the rim of her coffee cup, grounding herself. "I think that's the scariest part of writing," she whispered, "letting someone else inside your head." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "It's also the bravest." She let that sit. Then, as if surprising even herself, she pulled out a loose page from her notebook and slid it across the table. "This one? I've never shown it to anyone." Keanu didn't reach for it right away. He waited, letting her know that the decision was still hers. After a breath, she nodded. He picked it up and read it slowly, eyes scanning the careful scrawl. It was a paragraph about a girl who sat in a coffee shop, imagining what it would feel like to finally say what she meant without apology. A single line stood out, underlined twice in pen. "Sometimes, the quietest voices hold the loudest truths." Keanu looked up and met her eyes. "That," he said, tapping the line gently, "is the start of something real." Emily blinked fast, her throat tightening. "You think so?" "I know so," he replied. For a long moment, they just sat there. Not in silence, but in stillness. A kind of peace that didn't need explaining. Finally, Emily spoke. "Thank you, not just for today, for seeing me." Keanu smiled gently. "We don't always need the whole world to understand. Sometimes one person seeing you is enough to start again." She nodded, her shoulders just a little straighter. They walked out of the cafe together. The rain had stopped. The clouds were parting, letting through thin beams of sunlight. Keanu handed her the receipt from the book he had bought earlier. On the back, in his handwriting, were 3 words. "Keep going, Emily." She stared at it, then tucked it inside her notebook like a sacred bookmark. As they stepped onto the street, Keanu turned to her one last time and said, "Your story matters. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise." And just like that, he was gone. But Emily didn't feel small anymore. Not invisible. Not weird. She felt real. She felt enough. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle by the time they stood to leave the cafe. The world outside the window looked washed and gentle, the streets slick with reflections of yellow traffic lights and blurred taillights. Inside, the hum of soft jazz played low, mingling with the occasional hiss of the espresso machine. But around their little table, the air was hushed, still, full. Emily clutched her notebook with both hands now. It wasn't armor anymore. It felt like something new, like a map she hadn't realized she'd been drawing for years. She looked at it, then at the man sitting across from her, and then back down again, unsure of how to end something that had never been planned in the first place. Keanu stood up slowly, sliding his chair back with barely a sound. He didn't rush her, didn't fill the silence, just waited, like someone who understood the weight of a goodbye. Emily rose too, her bag slung over her shoulder. They stepped outside beneath the overhang. The street smelled like rain and old paperbacks from the used bookshop next door. She turned to him, her voice small but steady. "Would it be okay if I asked for a photo?" Keanu didn't react with surprise or amusement, just a soft blink, then a kind nod. "Of course." Emily reached into her coat pocket for her phone, but something made her pause. Her thumb hovered over the screen, unsure. The moment that had felt so full a second ago now felt like it might shrink if captured in pixels. She glanced up at him again. "Actually, I think I'd rather not." He didn't ask why. "I mean..." She hesitated, words catching in her throat. This was real. Quiet. "I want to remember it like this, not as a selfie." He smiled. "Some moments are meant to be kept quiet." She nodded, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. There was no awkwardness, no disappointment, just the understanding that not everything needs to be shared to be sacred, that some things, especially the ones that change you, are meant to be carried, not posted. They stood there for a moment, not speaking, just watching the mist curl around the edges of the street, the distant sounds of the city muffled by the wet air. Emily had never felt more present in her life. It was strange. She had spent most of her years disappearing into the corners of rooms, into pages, into silence. But right now, she felt seen in a way that didn't require explanation or performance. Keanu reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small notepad, the kind actors sometimes used to scribble notes between scenes. It was folded and soft at the corners. He flipped to a blank page and tore it carefully. Then he picked up a napkin from the cafe table and placed it flat against the wall beside them. With slow strokes, he wrote something. Not in a rush, not like someone famous giving an autograph, but like someone writing a promise. Emily tilted her head, curious but not asking. He turned the napkin around and handed it to her. It read, "Please, don't stop. The world needs your voice." She blinked quickly, then brought a hand to her mouth. The napkin trembled in her fingers. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. Keanu looked down the sidewalk and then back at her, calm as ever. "You already did." He tapped her notebook gently with one finger. Words don't have to shout, they just have to be true. The wind moved lightly through the street, tugging at her coat. Emily tucked the napkin into the back of her notebook like it belonged there all along. something inside her shifted, gently, like a door creaking open after years of being shut. She didn't thank him, not because she wasn't grateful, but because it didn't feel like the end. Gratitude was too small a word for what she felt. She simply nodded. He nodded back. They parted without fanfare, no photo, no handshake, just a shared understanding and the faint smile of two people who had met in the middle of their own silences. Emily turned down the street, the notebook under her arm and the napkin pressed close to her side. Her heart beat steadier now. Not loud, but clear. She didn't know where she was going next, but she was walking, and that was enough. That night, Emily returned to her small studio apartment, her notebook resting gently on her desk beside a cold cup of tea she'd forgotten to finish that morning. The bookstore bag still sat on the chair, untouched. She hadn't even remembered the book she bought. Her mind was still holding on to the weight of the napkin, tucked now between the pages of her journal like a bookmark from another life. She sat down and opened her notebook, not to write, just to look at it. It was filled with half-finished lines, notes in the margins, doodles where thoughts had run dry. But now it felt like something sacred, not just scribbles on paper. She flipped through slowly, page by page, reading her own voice as if it belonged to someone else, as if it had always been waiting to be heard. Then she stopped on the paragraph she had shown him, the one that made him say, "You have a voice." She stared at the words for a long time, noticing things she hadn't seen before. The way she had described the girl's silence, the girl's yearning to be seen without needing to perform. The way she had buried herself in the fictional character and, in doing so, revealed her truest self. It wasn't fiction. It had never been. She picked up her pen, not cautiously this time, but like someone reaching for the thing they trust most. And beneath the paragraph, she wrote something new. Today, I met someone who reminded me that I'm not invisible, and that maybe, just maybe, my words don't have to hide anymore. She put the pen down, closed the notebook, exhaled. Outside, the city kept moving. Quiet cars in the rain, soft footsteps on wet pavement. But inside, something had stilled. A kind of quiet that didn't feel empty. A kind of quiet that made space for new beginnings. Emily walked to her window and looked out at the streetlights reflecting on the slick asphalt. The night was calm, the kind of night that felt like it was listening. She pressed a hand to the glass, not knowing what she was reaching for, but knowing now that someone she never expected, had reached back. And that made all the difference. Emily didn't tell anyone about the meeting. Not because she was afraid they wouldn't believe her, but because she didn't want to share it with the world just yet. It felt like a fragile flame, something small and flickering that could be blown out too easily if too many people reached for it. A few days after that afternoon, she opened her notebook again, not to journal, not to sketch plot outlines, just to breathe through the pen. It was the first time in months she had written something for herself. Not out of obligation, not to distract herself from spiraling thoughts, but because something inside her had been touched, moved, nudged into life. The words came slowly, but they came. She started with a single paragraph about that rainy day, but she didn't name names. Instead, she described it like a moment from fiction. There was a girl who bumped into someone unexpected. She thought the moment would swallow her, but instead, it offered her a seat. She paused after writing that sentence. Her hands trembled again, just like they had in the bookstore. But she wasn't afraid this time. She opened a new browser tab and found a website that accepted anonymous personal essays. Not flashy, not viral, just a place where stories could live. Emily submitted her piece under a pseudonym, E.C. Harrow, a nod to her initials and her favorite moody British author. She clicked submit and closed her laptop immediately, like it might explode in her lap. Then she went and made tea and tried not to think about it. 3 days later, the essay was published. She didn't expect anyone to read it, but someone did. A comment appeared beneath it from a user named looking for quiet. I didn't know I needed this today, thank you. Then another. This made me feel seen. And another. I've been that girl in the bookstore. I cried reading this. Emily read the comments in stunned silence. Her hand went to her chest, where her breath had started to rise, faster and higher, but instead of a panic spiral, she felt something else. Like she'd dropped an anchor. Like she'd arrived somewhere. People weren't just reading her story, they were responding, feeling, finding themselves inside it. She wasn't invisible anymore. She kept writing. She didn't talk about Keanu. She didn't write about celebrities or miracles. She just wrote about presence, stillness, moments that mattered. In one piece, she wrote, "There was a man who said less than he listened." That changed everything. The essay gained quiet traction, not viral but steady, like rain soaking into the earth. People didn't scroll past it. They paused. They commented. Some even shared their own stories of bookstore moments, of strangers who said the right thing or said nothing and still made everything feel different. Emily didn't chase likes or reposts. She wrote another piece the next week, and then another. Each one a little more open, a little more steady in tone. She wrote about how silence could be comforting, how some people ask questions without words. She shared metaphors about shadows that softened in warm light, about notebooks becoming lighthouses. She still never mentioned Keanu, not even once, because it was never about a name, it was about a feeling. The second essay was titled, "When the Quiet Sees You Back." The third, "Some Coffee Shops Feel Like Cathedrals." Each piece added another layer to the thread of her voice, soft, unpolished, but real. Readers started to recognize her by style. The usernames in the comments section started returning. One woman left this message. "I don't know who you are, but you're writing the words I can't say out loud." Another said, "It's like your stories carry a lantern." Thank you. It became a small circle. Readers who found comfort in the margins. Strangers who didn't want headlines, just honesty. One night, Emily noticed a new essay prompt on the site. It asked, "Have you ever heard the exact words you needed right when you needed them most?" She didn't even hesitate. She began typing. Yes, and they weren't dramatic. They weren't loud. They were handwritten on a napkin. Her fingers hovered. She considered adding more, then she stopped. She didn't need to explain. The people who would understand already did. Later that week, she visited the same bookstore alone, not to look for him, just to be in the space where it had started. She stood in the same aisle. The light from the window caught the same corner of the shelf. A book slipped from its place and landed by her feet. Poetry. The same one she had touched that day. Emily picked it up, held it in her hands, and smiled. The page she opened had this line underlined. "You are not invisible. You are just waiting to be read." She sat down in the little reading nook and started to write again. She stayed in that nook until the bookstore lights dimmed, quietly scribbling the outline of her next essay. Not because she needed content, not because she owed anyone an update, but because something in her finally believed it mattered. The words didn't come in a rush. They never did. They arrived like guests at the edge of a storm. Timid, patient, respectful of silence. She let them take their time. When the essay went live 3 days later, it was titled, "The Man Who Didn't Save Me." The opening line was simple. Sometimes the people who change your life don't arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes they just sit beside you until you're ready to speak. It ended with a single sentence. "I am not healed, but I am here, and that counts." The piece was shared quietly across support forums, grief circles, and mental health blogs. Therapists printed it out. College professors discussed it. But more importantly, young writers read it and whispered, "Me too." It wasn't until weeks later that Emily saw a private message in her inbox. The sender had no profile photo, no flashy signature, just this. "You kept writing. I knew you would. Thank you for remembering what matters." There was no name, but she didn't need one. She placed her fingers to her lips and closed the browser. Later that night, as she sat on her fire escape with a warm blanket wrapped around her shoulders, she glanced toward the stars and whispered 2 words that held everything. "Thank you." The city around her buzzed with the same chaos it always had, but for once, she didn't feel drowned by it. The world felt quieter, like maybe her voice didn't need to roar to be heard. In that stillness, she took out her notebook again. Not for an essay, just a sentence. "The first time I was seen, I didn't say anything. But he heard me anyway." She tore the page out, folded it carefully, and tucked it inside the book she'd bought the day of their meeting. A bookmark, a reminder. Across the city, someone else sat reading in silence. A different coffee shop, a different kind of quiet. But if you listened close enough, you might have heard a heartbeat of connection bridging the two. That was all it took. Not a rescue. Just one person who noticed and stayed long enough to prove it. 2 years had passed since the quiet day in the bookstore that Emily Carter thought no one would ever remember but her. But something had shifted inside her that afternoon. Keanu hadn't offered her advice or rescued her from anxiety. He had done something quieter. He had listened, and that somehow gave her the courage to begin. A month after their encounter, Emily had started submitting personal essays online under a pen name. She never mentioned Keanu Reeves by name. She called him the stranger who didn't need me to be anything. Her stories weren't dramatic. They were soft, reflective, and honest. She wrote about what it was like to walk into a cafe and sit alone, how words sometimes refused to come, and how silence could be a language too. At first, she expected no one to read them. She thought they would float into the internet void like so many others. But slowly, people started to comment. Some whispered their gratitude in reply, saying they too had felt invisible at times. Others said her words gave them peace. One woman wrote, "Your story held me like a friend." Another simply wrote, "Thank you for seeing me." Emily never replied. She let the words exist quietly, like her. She continued writing, sometimes in the early hours of the morning, sometimes during long walks by the water. Her essays piled up on her small laptop, and eventually she curated them into a series of quiet reflections she titled "The Margins of Her Voice." Then, without warning, she received an email from a small independent publisher based in Oregon. The editor had stumbled across one of Emily's essays that had been shared in a support group for people with anxiety. The subject line of the email read, "Your voice matters. Let's talk." Emily almost deleted it, thinking it was spam, but something in the message felt sincere. The editor, a woman named Hallie, wrote, "I read your piece on the day my father passed away. It didn't make the grief go away, but it reminded me that silence can be sacred. Would you consider publishing your work as a collection?" Emily's hands trembled as she read the message again. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with the echo of something unfamiliar. Hope. She waited a week before replying. When she did, she wrote, "If anything I wrote ever helped someone, that's more than I ever thought possible. Yes, let's do it." Hallie called her the next day. Their conversation was short but warm. Hallie understood her silences and never rushed her. She said, "The world has enough noise. Your writing gives it space to breathe." It was the first time Emily had ever heard someone describe her words that way. The book was officially titled "The Margins of Her Voice," and in it Emily wrote the dedication with shaking fingers, "To the stranger who waited long enough for me to speak." The months leading up to publication were filled with quiet milestones Emily never imagined reaching. She proofread page layouts while sipping tea at the same cafe where she'd once sat across from Keanu. Her hands no longer trembled as they hovered over the keyboard. Instead, they moved with purpose, still gently, but with confidence now. She met her publisher, Hallie, in person once before the launch. Hallie brought her a small bouquet of wildflowers and said, "You don't have to perform today, just be." Emily nodded, that simple phrase somehow loosening the knot of tension in her chest. On the day of the book's release, Emily woke up with a familiar weight pressing on her ribs. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like vulnerability in its rawest form. Her story, her silences, her margins, would now belong to other people. Would they understand the quiet pain between the lines? Would they mock it, or worse, dismiss it entirely? She arrived at the small launch event wearing a gray cardigan and soft shoes, carrying nothing but a pen and her worn notebook. The bookstore, the very same one where everything had started, had arranged a cozy reading corner near the front window. A little table, a chair, a display of her books next to a tiny vase of daisies. She scanned the faces of those who came. A few looked familiar from online comments. Most were strangers, holding her book close to their chests like something tender. Emily was invited to read a passage aloud. She almost declined. Then she opened the book and turned to the second essay, the one about feeling invisible in a room full of people. Her voice cracked only once. She took a breath, remembered Keanu's quiet gaze, and read through. Afterward, people lined up, not for selfies or small talk, but to quietly say thank you. Then, as things began to wind down and she packed her pen away, her publisher approached with a brown paper package. It had no return address, no logo, just her name written in neat black ink and a small sketch drawn on the corner of the envelope. It was the outline of a napkin with a folded edge. Emily blinked. Her heart skipped once, then again. Ali smiled and whispered, "It was left at the front desk early this morning. No one saw who dropped it off." With trembling fingers, Emily carefully opened the package. Inside was a pristine first edition of The Catcher in the Rye. Tucked between its pages was a single note, written on thick paper with a single sentence. "Heard you made it?" There was no signature, just a tiny sketch of steam rising from a coffee cup. Emily stared at the sketch. Her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and wonder. Her fingers traced the curve of the rising steam. That simple drawing carried more weight than most full paragraphs she'd ever read. It wasn't just a message, it was a remembering, a promise kept. She held the note against her chest for a moment, then gently slid it back into the book. She didn't need to tell anyone who it was from. She didn't need to explain the symbol or the memory it held. Some things weren't meant to be decoded. They were meant to be felt. Later that night, back home in her apartment, Emily placed the package on her desk beside a small framed photo of her parents and a worn mug that still smelled faintly of cinnamon tea. She opened her laptop and typed a new post for her readers, scheduled to publish the next morning. It read, "I used to think quiet people didn't leave marks, that we drifted behind the loud ones, unseen and untouched. But today I saw how wrong I was. If you're reading this and you've ever felt like your voice didn't matter, please don't give up. Somewhere, someone is waiting for the sound only you can make. No fanfare, no hashtags, just presence." The next day, messages flooded in. Emails, blog comments, even handwritten letters forwarded by her publisher. One from a teenage girl said, "I read your book in one sitting. I stopped hiding my notebook after." Another simply wrote, "You're the reason I started talking again." Emily answered as many as she could, slowly, personally, and with the same care she had once received. It wasn't about becoming a bestseller author or doing book tours. For her, it was about resonance, the kind that hums beneath the noise and finds you when you're alone. That weekend, she visited the same bookstore where she'd met Keanu all those years ago. It was quiet, as always, and the familiar creak of the floorboards brought a strange comfort. She found herself back in the same aisle where it all began, between poetry and memoirs. There, tucked between two spines, was a folded napkin. Her fingers hesitated before reaching out, but when she opened it, it was blank. No message, no drawing. Still, she smiled. She folded it again, placed it in her coat pocket, and walked toward the exit. The rain had started again, light and steady. She didn't pull her hood up. As she crossed the street, a child walked past her holding a book to their chest, the same title as hers. They didn't see her. But that was okay, because now she no longer needed to be seen to know she mattered. The cafe looked almost exactly the same. 2 years had passed since Emily had first bumped into Keanu near the mystery novels, since the coffee that changed her direction, since the napkin note that asked her not to stop writing. Today, the cafe's windows were streaked with late autumn rain. Inside, soft jazz played low through the ceiling speakers. The baristas moved quietly, respectful of the occasion. Chairs had been rearranged into a small half-circle. A simple table stood at the front with a microphone and one copy of her debut book, The Margins of Her Voice. Emily stood behind that table now, palms resting gently against its edge. Her breath came slow and steady, the kind of calm that only arrives after months of learning how not to run from your own heartbeat. She looked out at the faces before her, not a crowd, just a gathering, the kind of audience that didn't need noise to be moved. There were writers, librarians, a mother with a toddler asleep on her chest, 2 teenagers whispering to each other, their fingers curled around matching bookmarks. Emily glanced at the barista, who gave her a nod. She opened a book. "The first time I spoke," she began, her voice quiet but certain. "No one heard it but me." The room leaned in. "I wasn't trying to be a writer, I was just trying to feel real." There were no cameras, no press, just a moment, soft, sincere, sacred. Emily read for 12 minutes. Her voice occasionally trembled but never broke. She chose 3 short passages, one about fear, one about stillness, and one about the day someone noticed her notebook before they ever noticed her. When she finished, the silence was not empty. It was full. Then came a sound, a chair scraping gently against tile. A woman stood up near the back. Her scarf was wrapped tight, her eyes red-rimmed but kind. "Your words," the woman said softly, "helped me start therapy last month, after 10 years." Emily blinked fast, nodded. No words came yet. Another voice followed, this one younger. A boy, maybe 16, wearing a hoodie that swallowed his frame. "My sister," he started, then stopped. Swallowed. "She doesn't talk much. But after reading your book, she asked if we could sit together and write stories. That's the first thing she's asked me in a year." Emily placed a hand over her chest. She didn't thank them, not because she wasn't grateful, but because anything she could say would feel too small for what they'd just offered. A pause hung between them, and then with the faintest smile she said, "This story, it started when someone didn't walk away." The room didn't clap, not yet. They just sat with it, held it, like something too valuable to break with sound. A hand went up slowly in the front row. It belonged to a middle-aged man in a plaid shirt. He looked like someone who worked with his hands, rough fingers, tired eyes, but something gentle in his voice when he spoke. "I came here because my daughter dragged me," he said. "But I just want to say, I didn't know I needed this." Emily's lips parted slightly in surprise. The man nodded, eyes damp. "I lost my wife 2 years ago, and I haven't been to a bookstore since, or a cafe, really. But when you read that line, the one about grief not being loud but always present, I felt like someone was sitting beside me again." A quiet murmur moved through the crowd. Not noise, just presence. Emily stepped out from behind the table. She didn't know what to do with this kind of honesty, so she didn't try to package it. She just walked slowly to the man and placed a hand on his shoulder. Not to fix him, just to say, "I see you too." When she returned to the front, a few people had begun wiping their eyes. Others sat completely still, hands wrapped around paper cups, afraid to break the spell. She took a sip of water, then smiled at the group. "I used to think invisibility was something people did to me," she said, "but I realize now it's something I learned to do to myself. And writing was the first time I started showing up." A soft laugh broke from someone in the back. "You showed up hard," a woman whispered. Emily looked down at her hands. She thought of the notebook she used to carry, the one she clutched the day she bumped into him near the mystery section, the one that held all the parts of her she was too afraid to say out loud. She still had it, kept it on a shelf now, beside the napkin. "I want you to know," she continued, "this story isn't just mine anymore. Every time someone reads it or tells their own version of it, it becomes something bigger, something shared." Someone from the cafe staff brought her another cup of tea. She nodded gratefully but didn't take a sip yet. Instead, she leaned into the silence, let it stretch, let it breathe. Then she said something she hadn't planned. "I never told him thank you." A hush moved through the room. "I didn't because I don't think it was about gratitude. I think it was about presence, about someone choosing to stay when it would have been easier to walk away." That's when the first applause came. Not thunderous, but real. The applause faded into a quiet kind of reverence. No one reached for their phones. No one left. Emily let the hush settle before returning to her seat, clutching a copy of her book like it was something sacred, not because of its cover, but because it held a history that once belonged to silence. A young woman approached the table with a trembling smile. She held a copy of the margins of her voice and whispered, "Would you sign mine?" Emily blinked fast, then nodded. As she took the pen, her hand paused. "What's your name?" "Rachel." "Thank you, Rachel." She signed the book, not with flair but with deliberate care, writing slowly across the blank page. "For Rachel. You matter. You always did." Rachel didn't say anything at first. She just clutched the book to her chest and stepped back into the circle of chairs, as if holding something breakable that was also somehow whole. More people came up after. A teenage boy with a shy glance, a man holding his daughter's hand, a woman who said, "This is the first time I've left my house in a month." None of them asked about Keanu. Not a single person brought up fame or movies or anything beyond what they felt when they read Emily's words. And that, to her, was the most astonishing part of all. Before the reading ended, Emily stood once more. She held her tea now, hand steady, voice gentle. "There's a quote I keep close," she said. It goes, "You never know when your presence could be someone's forever." That day in the bookstore, I thought I had nothing to offer. I was small, afraid, silent. She paused, looked out across the small makeshift crowd. But someone chose to speak gently, to listen, to ask instead of assume. And from that came this. She held up the book. "And from this, maybe something in you begins too." A woman in the back sniffled. A man at the door placed his hand over his heart. And in the far corner, a child whispered something to their parent, who nodded through tears. Emily sat down again, her heart full, but not overwhelmed. Not this time. And as the cafe emptied slowly, the last person to leave walked by her and quietly said, "This story, you never said his name, but I think we all know who he is." Emily smiled. "You say it was never about him anyway." Then the door closed gently behind them, and Emily stayed for a while longer. Tea lukewarm, book pressed against her chest. The quiet around her not lonely anymore, but peaceful, present, alive. The evening air in downtown Seattle was crisp, washed clean by a soft drizzle that had finally stopped an hour earlier. Street lamps cast a golden hue on the wet pavement, turning sidewalks into glowing rivers of reflection. Inside the familiar cafe, now closed to the public for a private event, Emily Carter stood surrounded by quiet applause, a single hardcover book in her trembling hands. She had just finished reading a passage from her debut memoir, words that once only existed in the margins of her notebook, now echoing softly in the hearts of those who had gathered. The room had felt sacred, still, as if no one dared to breathe too loudly. A woman had cried. A teenage boy had hugged his mother. And Emily, she had stood with a voice steady enough to carry. Across the street, just beyond the glow of the cafe's wide windows, a man sat alone on a city bench. Dressed simply in jeans and a dark jacket, hood up, he blended in with the shadows. A to-go cup rested in his gloved hands, mostly untouched. But his eyes, soft and thoughtful, never left the cafe's entrance. Keanu Reeves didn't need to be inside the room to feel the moment. He had already lived his part in this story. What remained now wasn't a need to be acknowledged, but to hold space, to honor, quietly, what had unfolded. He watched as one by one people emerged from the cafe, some chatting, others wiping at their eyes. Emily stayed behind for a moment, helping to stack books and thank the staff. Her hair had loosened from the bun she'd tied nervously at the start of the night. She looked tired but fulfilled, like someone who had crossed a quiet finish line no one else had seen. And then, for just a heartbeat, she paused at the front door. She stepped out into the night, inhaled deeply, and looked toward the sky. Keanu didn't move, didn't wave, didn't call her name, but she tilted her head as if sensing something. She glanced once across the street. The light caught the side of his face just enough to reveal a small smile, barely there, almost imagined, and just as quickly he bowed his head again, blending back into the night. Not everyone is meant to stay in the spotlight. Some were meant to hold the edge of it, gently, like a steady hand on a trembling shoulder. That was Keanu's place tonight, not as the hero of the story, but as the witness. Emily didn't say anything to the man on the bench. She didn't need to. The connection that had started with a single bump in a bookstore had become something far deeper than proximity or conversation. It had become presence. And presence, as she now understood, didn't need to announce itself. Back inside, someone had taken a candid photo through the cafe window just moments before the reading had begun. It was later posted by the cafe's manager on their social media with the caption, "Tonight's guest changed more than the room. She reminded us what courage looks like when it whispers." But it wasn't the post that went viral. It was the photo in the background. Faintly visible in the reflection of the glass, across the street, was the silhouette of a man sitting alone. The hood made it difficult to confirm his identity, but those who knew, knew. A journalist later noticed the image and reached out to the cafe. They confirmed no one had invited Keanu Reeves. No press, no announcements, just one quiet figure outside the story he helped write. When asked to comment, the journalist received no formal response, just a short message from someone close to Keanu's team. Not all kindness speaks, some of it just stays close. The line struck a nerve. Across forums and comment sections, people began to share their own aha moments of unseen encouragement. A father who sat quietly in the back row of his daughter's first piano recital. A friend who drove 3 hours to wait outside a job interview just in case. A teacher who mailed a student's first poem back to her years later with the note, "I always believed in this." And now there was Emily. Once the girl too afraid to say hello, now the author whose words had found a way into the hearts of strangers. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. After the reading, back in her apartment, she placed a copy of her book on a shelf beside a weathered napkin she had saved for 2 years. The ink had faded, but the message remained. "Please don't stop. The world needs your voice." Beside it sat the first edition of The Catcher in the Rye, the anonymous gift she still hadn't tried to trace. She didn't want to. The mystery wasn't the point, the meaning was. And meaning, she now believed, didn't need an audience. It just needed truth. Outside her window, the rain had started again, soft and rhythmic, like footsteps moving away. Or maybe just waiting a little longer, in case she needed to know someone was still there. The next morning, Emily opened her inbox to find dozens of new messages. Most were from readers, people she had never met, thanking her for sharing a story that made them feel human again. But one message stood out. It came from a local high school teacher. The subject line read, "You visited our classroom without knowing." The body of the message was short. "One of my students hasn't spoken in months. Today he brought your book to class. He pointed to a paragraph and whispered, "She writes like I feel." Thank you for giving him a mirror. Emily sat frozen in her kitchen, her coffee cooling beside her. She hadn't expected this. She had written for herself, for her healing, for the girl who used to fold up poems and hide them in the back of dresser drawers. Now, somehow, those same words were helping others do what she once thought impossible. Feel visible. That evening, she walked back to the cafe, not for a reading, not to be seen, but just to sit. She ordered tea and found a corner seat facing the window. Across the street, the bench was empty this time, but she imagined what had happened there the week before. A man in a black coat. A gentle stillness, no need for applause or recognition, just presence. She took out her notebook, still the same one she had carried the day she met him, and turned to a blank page. With a deep breath, she wrote a single sentence. Some people lift you by showing up when you're not even sure you matter. And beneath it she drew a small, simple symbol, a coffee cup with steam curling into the shape of a question mark. It wasn't just a sketch, it was a reminder that sometimes the biggest shifts in life begin with quiet questions, not loud answers. As the sky darkened outside, Emily sat in the gentle hum of the cafe, her fingers tracing the edge of the page. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again, but she didn't need to. The man on the bench had done more than witness her journey. He had sparked it, and that spark, however quiet, was now lighting the way for others too. From across the room, the barista looked up and smiled. "You're the writer, right?" she asked softly. Emily smiled back, not shyly, not with hesitation. "Yes," she said, "I guess I am." And for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to explain. The rain was light that morning in Seattle, the kind of gentle drizzle that made the city feel wrapped in a soft hush. Emily Carter stepped off the bus just a few blocks from the corner bookstore. Her steps were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. It had been 6 years since she first walked through those doors. 6 years since everything quietly began to change. She paused outside the glass window, watching the flicker of warm yellow light spill across shelves stacked with paperbacks. The local authors section was right where it had always been, just past the register. Her book was still there. Sometimes she checked, not out of ego but as a reminder, that the girl who once whispered her words only to paper had become someone else. Or maybe someone more herself. Emily walked in, the bell above the door chiming its familiar welcome. The scent of roasted coffee and old books wrapped around her like a sweater. The floorboards creaked under her feet. Another unchanged detail she found comforting. She wandered slowly through the aisles, her fingers trailing across the spines, pausing when they passed her own name. The margins of her voice. She didn't linger. At the back of the shop, near the poetry shelves, a teenage girl sat cross-legged on the floor, notebook open, pencil tapping anxiously against her lip. She looked up, startled when a stack of her loose pages slid from her lap and scattered across the floor. Without hesitation, Emily crouched down, helping her gather the fluttering pages. Their hands touched briefly, just fingertips, but the girl seemed stunned, as if electricity had passed between them. "Thanks," the girl murmured, brushing her bangs from her eyes. Emily offered a soft smile. "Keep writing." The girl stared at her, confused for a moment. Then a flicker of recognition lit her face. "Wait, are you Emily Carter?" Emily hesitated only a beat, then she nodded. "We all start somewhere," she said quietly. The girl's eyes widened, her mouth opening slightly like she wanted to say more, but Emily gently handed back the last page, gave a small wave, and turned toward the exit. As she left the store, the rain had stopped completely. A faint sun peeked through the clouds, casting a golden hue over the sidewalk. Emily walked without rushing, carrying nothing but a single new journal tucked beneath her arm. Back inside the bookstore, the girl clutched her notebook to her chest. When she opened it to slip her pages back in, she noticed something new tucked between them, a folded note in different handwriting. She opened it slowly. It read, "The world needs your voice." The girl read the note again, her heart racing. It was handwritten, ink slightly smudged at the edges, as if it had been folded in a hurry. No name, no signature, just that line, "The world needs your voice." She looked up from the notebook, but Emily was already gone. The door was swinging gently on its hinges, and the street outside was empty except for a dog walker and a city bus pulling away. Still, the weight of the moment stayed with her. She tucked the note carefully between the front pages of her journal like a pressed flower, precious and delicate. Then she picked up her pencil, turned to a clean page, and began to write. Not because someone told her to, but because someone saw her. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, Emily wandered into a quiet cafe and ordered a cup of chamomile tea. She took the corner table, opened her own notebook, and began scribbling a few lines of poetry. Nothing formal, just thoughts that had been resting under her ribs all morning. She wasn't thinking about fame. She wasn't thinking about books or signings or sales. She was thinking about the girl in the bookstore and how she'd once been her, afraid, quiet, uncertain if anyone would care what she had to say. Emily smiled to herself and wrote a new phrase in the margins. "We become the words we never heard until we say them ourselves." Outside the cafe window, the world moved on. Buses, umbrellas, passers-by hurrying between errands. But inside, there was stillness. The kind that only comes from knowing you've done something that matters, even if no one else sees it. Later that evening, the bookstore clerk, a man named Jamie who had worked there for years, found himself restocking the shelves when he saw the girl return. She didn't browse. She went straight to the local authors section and pulled Emily's book from the shelf. Jamie raised an eyebrow. "Good pick." The girl nodded, hugging the book close. "She was here earlier," Jamie said, realizing what must have happened. "She doesn't come often, but when she does, it's always quiet." The girl didn't say anything, just smiled. That night, she read the first chapter of The Margins of Her Voice beneath a blanket with a flashlight, just like Emily once did as a girl. And when she reached the dedication, she gasped, "To the stranger who waited long enough for me to speak." She traced the words with her finger, then glanced down at the folded note resting on her nightstand. "The world needs your voice." And for the first time, she believed it. The studio lights were soft, not glaring. The set was minimal. 2 armchairs, a small table, and a warm rug underfoot. It wasn't the kind of place where gossip headlines were born. It was a space for reflection. Keanu Reeves sat across from a journalist known for her thoughtful approach, not for chasing viral clips. Her questions were quiet, layered with curiosity. She leaned forward and said, "Over the years, you've inspired a lot of people, some in very personal ways. Has anyone ever reached out and changed you?" Keanu didn't respond right away. He looked down at the coffee cup between his hands, turning it slowly. His silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was familiar. Then he nodded, almost to himself, as if reaching into a memory he hadn't touched in a while. "There was a girl once," he said softly. "I don't think she knew how bright she was." The interviewer didn't rush him. "Was this someone you met during a fan event?" He shook his head. "No, it wasn't planned. It happened, quietly, in a bookstore." That one word hung in the air. Bookstore. It wasn't specific, but it didn't need to be. Viewers who knew the story, or thought they did, would feel the echo immediately. "She was standing in the aisle," Keanu continued, holding this notebook like it held the last bit of who she was. "She didn't say much, but I could feel something. Familiar. Like what I used to feel when I'd walk into a room and hope no one noticed me." The interviewer blinked. "You felt like that?" He gave a small, genuine smile. "More often than people think." He didn't name her. He didn't describe her features, her clothes, or her full story. But in that quiet moment, everyone watching could sense the weight of the memory. It wasn't about a celebrity meeting a fan. It was about 2 people, both carrying silence in different ways, meeting where neither had to pretend. She let me read something she'd written, Keanu said. Just a paragraph, but it cracked something open in me. The honesty in it? I don't know. It reminded me that the world is still full of voices we don't hear enough. He looked up, and those are usually the ones worth listening to. The interviewer let that settle. No follow-up, no pivot, just space. Keanu leaned back in his chair, eyes distant now. She didn't ask for advice. She didn't even want a photo. She just needed to be seen. And sometimes that's all we really need. Then came the question the audience was waiting for, delivered gently. Are you still in touch? Keanu's answer came with a slight shake of his head and a smile that didn't fade. Some lights, he said. Don't need to stay close to stay lit. The interviewer paused after his response. There was something in his voice. Not grief, not nostalgia, but reverence. Like someone remembering a single candle that once lit up a dark room, long after the flame had gone out. She was a writer? The interviewer asked. Keanu nodded slowly. She had a voice, one of those quiet ones. You know the type, the kind you only hear if you really stop moving. Most people don't. He glanced off camera for a moment, as if thinking about how rare it was for anyone to truly listen. Then he added, she didn't say much about her past, but there was this moment where she said she used to feel invisible. His voice lowered, not dramatically, but intimately. I know that feeling. Not in the exact same way, but I've walked through rooms full of people, premieres, sets, interviews, and felt like a shadow. The interviewer didn't interrupt. She knew better. It's easy to assume fame fixes loneliness, Keanu continued, but it doesn't. Sometimes it just puts it in a glass case where everyone can stare at it. There was a long pause, then he smiled gently. But she reminded me that kindness can be quiet. It can just be sitting across a table, drinking coffee, and not asking someone to be anything they're not. The interviewer leaned forward slightly. Do you think she ever knew what that moment meant to you? I don't know, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. And I'm okay with that. The audience watching from home didn't need a name. They didn't need a timeline. What they heard was something deeper, an acknowledgement that sometimes the most powerful connections don't need labels or photos. They just live inside you. The interviewer smiled softly. You've made a lot of movies, had a lot of iconic moments. What makes this one stay with you? Keanu took a slow breath. Because it wasn't about performance. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't a scene. It was real and rare. He looked down at his hands again. She didn't want to be rescued. She just needed someone to not walk away. There was silence again, not awkward, but sacred. Finally, the interviewer said, if she's watching this, what would you say? Keanu's gaze lifted, his eyes warm, focused. I'd say thank you for trusting a stranger enough to sit still, for reminding me that presence matters more than perfection. Then he smiled a little, eyes crinkling, and for proving that one sentence, one real sentence, can change a life. The clip from that interview didn't go viral because of drama. It wasn't trending because of controversy or conflict. It resonated because of its stillness, because it felt like someone whispering something beautiful in a world that wouldn't stop shouting. People started sharing the quote online. She didn't want to be rescued. She just needed someone to not walk away. It appeared on bookmarks, on blogs, on whiteboards in high school classrooms. Therapists quoted it, writers framed it, and though her name was never spoken, Emily's story quietly wrapped itself around the hearts of people who had felt unseen. In a bookstore in Montana, a young woman bought Emily's book after watching the interview. In a library in Tokyo, a copy sat on the staff favorites shelf. In New York, a subway commuter read one of her essays, printed on a tearaway sheet in a community zine. The impact rippled. Meanwhile, Keanu never spoke of her again in interviews, not because he forgot, but because he didn't need to say more. The truth of that moment had already settled into the places it was meant to go. At a fan convention months later, someone asked Keanu during a Q&A, "What's one thing you wish more people understood?" He thought for a long time, then answered, that being noticed and being seen are two different things. The first fades, the second changes you. He didn't elaborate, and he didn't have to. Back in Seattle, in a cozy independent bookstore with rain tapping the windows, the manager restocked a stack of The Margins of Her Voice by Emily Carter. A small sign read, "For anyone who ever felt invisible. You aren't." And just below it, a napkin rested inside a clear frame. On it, faded but legible, was the handwriting that had once changed everything. "Please don't stop. The world needs your voice." Years later, it was still there. Not because it needed to be, but because it mattered. To the staff, to the readers, to anyone who had ever wondered whether their story, quiet, uncertain, unfinished, was worth telling. In that interview, Keanu Reeves had reminded the world of something most people forget. You don't need to change the whole world to change someone's world. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is sit beside a stranger and remind them they matter. Even if you never say your name, even if you never see them again. The ballroom buzzed with quiet anticipation. Rows of folding chairs faced a modest panel stage, lit by warm yellow lights. A banner above read, "Writing Through Silence, Voices That Found the Page." Among the speakers sat Emily Carter, now 32, her once nervous posture replaced with a quiet composure. She wore a soft blue sweater, her notebook resting on the table in front of her like armor that had seen her through every storm. She wasn't the most famous writer in the room, not even close. But when it was her turn to speak, the silence that fell said everything. Emily didn't tell the whole story. She never did. She spoke instead about how fear can lock words in your throat, how writing had been the only way she knew how to exist in the world when talking felt impossible. "I think some of us write because it's the only way we can shout without raising our voices," she said quietly. "It's the only way we feel heard, even when no one's listening." Applause didn't erupt. It emerged gently, like rain beginning to fall. She bowed her head, not out of shyness, but as if sharing the weight of that truth with the room. Afterward, Emily sat at the signing table. The line wasn't long, but those who waited did so with purpose. A teacher who used her book in a high school class. A teen who said her blog helped her leave an emotionally abusive relationship. An older woman who said simply, "You made me feel seen." Then came the man in the black coat. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't say a word. He slid a slim, well-worn notebook across the table. Emily opened it. There, pressed carefully between the pages, was a napkin, yellowed at the edges, the handwriting unmistakable. "Please don't stop. The world needs your voice." Her breath caught. She looked up, but the man was already walking away. Emily rose slowly from her chair, her hand still lightly resting on the napkin. Her gaze followed the man weaving through the thinning crowd. He wasn't rushing, but there was a quiet intention in his steps. He reached the double doors at the back of the room just as they began to close behind someone else. Then, as if sensing her eyes on him, he turned back. No wave, no smile. Just a small, unmistakable nod. A gesture she hadn't seen in years, but one she'd never forgotten. The door clicked shut. Her breath trembled, but she didn't cry. She just sat back down, eyes on the notebook in front of her, heart pounding not with surprise, but with something deeper. Gratitude, recognition, full circle grace. The next woman in line leaned forward. "Are you okay?" Emily looked at her and nodded. "Better than okay." After the event ended, Emily stayed behind. The napkin, the notebook, it stayed cradled in her hands like a story returned. She traced the faded ink with her fingertips. The words were the same, but they meant more now. He hadn't just written them once. He'd believed them. enough to return them years later, quietly and without credit. Later that evening, back at her hotel, she opened her suitcase and slid the napkin into the inner pocket of the leather-bound case she used for her journals. She didn't need to frame it. She didn't need to post it. Its power had never been in being seen. Its power was in being remembered. She stood by the window, watching the street below, her reflection softened by the light. Behind her, the conference badge still hung around her neck, brushing gently against her collarbone like a whisper from the past. Then she did something she hadn't done in a while. She opened her laptop, created a blank document, and titled it, "What Quiet Can Build." The cursor blinked on the white screen, patient and open. Emily rested her fingers on the keys, but didn't rush. Instead, she listened. To the hum of the radiator, to the muted sounds of traffic outside, to the quiet inside her own chest. That same quiet she once feared would swallow her, now felt like something else entirely. Space. Breath. Beginning. The next morning, she woke early and walked to a nearby park before her flight. She brought the notebook and napkin with her, not to reread, but to keep close. She sat on a bench beneath a tree just beginning to bloom. A woman pushing a stroller passed by and smiled. Emily smiled back. No panic, no fear, just presence. For a long time, she wrote with her legs tucked beneath her and her coat wrapped tightly against the breeze. Not pages of polished prose, but lines that felt real. Lines about doubt, about stillness, about the kind of encouragement that asks for nothing in return. By the time the sky began to shift toward gold, she closed the notebook and leaned back, looking up through the branches. One falling petal drifted down, catching on her sleeve. She didn't brush it off. Instead, she whispered, not to anyone near, but maybe to someone still listening. I kept writing. Back at the hotel, she packed slowly. She held the notebook last, placing it gently between soft sweaters as if it were something living. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again. That wasn't the point. The napkin had come back. The man had come back. But the real miracle was what had stayed. Her voice. As she zipped her bag and reached for her keys, she paused just a second longer to look in the mirror. For the first time in years, she didn't look invisible. She looked like someone who had been seen and had decided to stay that way. Not because of fame, not because of luck, but because one quiet nod years ago had told her she was worth hearing. And somehow, she'd believed it. Emily Carter stood in front of the whiteboard, her fingers curled loosely around a stack of printed handouts. The classroom was quiet, save for the soft rustle of backpacks being unzipped and notebooks opening. It was her first day teaching a community writing workshop, a free 8-week program offered through the library. She had expected 5 or 6 people to sign up. Instead, the folding chairs were full, and a few latecomers stood by the wall. Most were younger than her, some were older. A teenage girl with braces sat beside a retired man who wore a ball cap with a faded NASA logo. A single mother with a toddler on her lap balanced a pen between her fingers, ready. No one seemed particularly confident, but they all looked hopeful, and maybe that was enough. Emily took a quiet breath. "Thank you for being here," she began, her voice gentle but clear. "I used to be someone who didn't speak much, not out loud, but I wrote, because on paper, the world didn't interrupt." A few people nodded, visibly relating. Emily glanced at the framed napkin on the back wall, carefully mounted behind glass. "Please, don't stop. The world needs your voice." It was the same note Keanu had given her years ago, on a rainy day in a tiny cafe when she hadn't even believed she had a voice at all. "I thought I'd start by reading you something," she said. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. It was the first story I ever finished. I wrote it the day after someone reminded me I was worth listening to. She unfolded a page that had been handled too many times to still be pristine. The edges were soft. The ink was slightly smudged. It's called The Girl Who Spoke in Ink. As she began to read, the classroom hushed further. Her voice wasn't theatrical, it wasn't polished, but it was steady. It came from somewhere honest, and when she finished the first paragraph, she looked up and saw something that made her throat tighten. The single mother's eyes were glistening. The teenager was sitting still, both hands cupped over her heart. The man in the NASA cap was staring into space, blinking slowly. Emily continued, one page at a time, not hurrying, not hiding. The story unfolded like memory, soft, raw, and utterly true. By the time she reached the final sentence, Emily's voice had dropped to a whisper. The girl didn't speak with her mouth, she spoke with paper. And the world, finally, listened. Silence followed, but not the heavy kind she used to fear, the one that made her feel like she didn't exist. This one felt full, held, like the room was breathing with her. The class didn't erupt into applause. No one cheered, but one by one people leaned forward, eyes shimmering, hands slowly reaching for pens. Emily closed the folder gently and sat down. "Now," she said with a soft smile, "tell me about the stories you're afraid to write." A woman in her 50s raised her hand first. "I want to write about my mother, but I'm scared I won't do her justice." A pause. Emily nodded. "Then start by writing what you remember, not what you fear," the teenager whispered. "Can I write about anxiety without making it sound dramatic?" "Yes," Emily replied, "because it's real. That makes it enough." One man hesitated, then admitted, "I've never told anyone that I want to write. I work in construction, my friends would laugh." Emily smiled gently. "Then tell no one. Write anyway." The framed napkin caught the afternoon light and glowed behind her. One student glanced back at it and whispered the words aloud to himself. "Please, don't stop. The world needs your voice." Someone had once given her that sentence like a lifeline. Now, it lived on the wall, not as decoration, but as a kind of quiet permission. Emily watched as the students leaned into their notebooks. A few wrote furiously. Others just stared at the page, chewing their pens, thinking. One woman simply held the blank sheet and pressed it to her chest. Stories were being born in the quiet, and no one had to shout. Emily stayed behind after the last student left. The chairs were slightly askew, notebooks forgotten on tables, mugs half drained of tea. She didn't tidy up right away. Instead, she walked to the wall and stood in front of the framed napkin, reading it again, as if for the first time. "Please don't stop. The world needs your voice." She closed her eyes and let those words wrap around her like a soft coat. She thought of that day in the bookstore, the rain, the shelves, her trembling hands. She thought of the man who had seen something in her before she had. He hadn't tried to fix her. He'd simply listened, reminded her she mattered, then quietly stepped back. From her bag, she pulled out a new napkin and a pen. Sitting at the edge of the nearest desk, she wrote slowly, "You reminded me what silence can say." Then she folded it, placed it in the center of the room and walked out, leaving the lights on for the next class. Later that week, one of her students posted a photo of the classroom on social media. In the background, the napkin hung like a quiet banner. The caption read, "Some teachers show you how to write. Mine showed me how to speak." It was shared hundreds of times. People began tagging friends, saying, "This reminds me of you," or "You need to see this." The post found its way into corners of the internet where anxious hearts waited quietly for permission to exist, to create, to be seen. Emily didn't know about the post until a former classmate emailed it to her. She read the caption again and again. Then, instead of replying, she walked to her desk and began drafting the next week's lesson plan. Prompt: write the moment someone saw you, and you knew it. The world hadn't changed overnight. She still struggled with crowded rooms, still hesitated before opening her inbox, still sometimes panicked at the sound of her own name. But her voice was no longer locked inside margins. It now lived in classrooms, in comments, in the hands of strangers carrying her book through airport terminals. And it lived, most quietly and most powerfully, in every story being written in her workshop. Stories sparked not by applause, but by presence. And that presence, she knew, had begun the moment someone had bumped into her and didn't walk away. The mirror wasn't expensive. It didn't come from a designer store or some artisan's booth at a craft fair. Emily had picked it up at a thrift shop years ago when she was still too shy to attend any of the writing meetups she'd bookmarked online. It had a small chip in the bottom right corner and the faintest silvering at the edges, but something about it felt safe, familiar, like it didn't ask her to smile when she didn't want to. For years, the mirror leaned against the wall behind her door, half forgotten. It caught glimpses of her life in fragments, her hands flipping notebook pages, her shoulders sagging with rejection letters, her eyes scanning book spines for courage. Now the mirror hung next to her bookshelf, elevated to eye level, framed by warm string lights and the smell of worn paper, and etched in the corner, in neat block letters that she'd nervously commissioned from a local glass worker, were two words that had changed everything. Keep writing. She didn't touch the mirror often, but when she did, it was with a reverence she didn't fully understand. Some mornings, she'd pause in front of it before sitting down to draft a chapter. Other nights, when self-doubt crept in like fog, she'd trace those words with her finger, as if remembering that someone had seen something in her long before the world did. Below the mirror, her bookshelf had grown. Once it was only filled with the classics, Austen, Salinger, Morrison, books she admired but never imagined herself worthy of standing beside. Now, nestled between them, were her own. 3 paperbacks, their spines modest but proud, each bearing her name. Each one with margins filled by readers who had once felt invisible too. She never alphabetized the shelf. Her books didn't sit in chronological order. Instead, she arranged them like a conversation. Hers next to the ones that gave her permission to begin. Her words beside the ones that carried her when she had none. And tucked at the end of the second row, with a cloth cover worn by time and hands she'd never met, sat a copy of the Matrix screenplay. Signed. The inscription inside was simple, "To Emily," because words aren't always loud. She never told anyone how she got it. Some stories, she'd learned, were best kept sacred. But every so often, when the house was quiet and the wind moved through the trees like soft breath, she'd open the screenplay to the first page, reread the note, and close it again with a grateful sigh. Then she'd look up at the mirror, touch the corner, and sit down to write. Emily's home wasn't grand, but it was hers. A small one-bedroom with creaky floorboards, thrifted rugs, and windows that let in just enough morning light to make the living room feel like a sanctuary. Her desk, placed by the window, overlooked a narrow alley lined with ivy. She loved the quiet hum of the world outside. No pressure, no audience, just the slow rhythm of her thoughts becoming sentences. Sometimes, when she hosted her writing group, someone would ask about the mirror. Not directly, but they'd glance at it. The etching always drew attention. Keep writing. A command? A prayer? A memory? She never offered the full story. Only once, when a young woman lingered in front of it, did she say, "It was something someone told me when I really needed to hear it." The girl nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. Emily didn't want the focus to be on the mirror or the books or the story that launched them all. She wanted it to be on the feeling, the truth that silence isn't the absence of voice, and visibility isn't about spotlight. It's about knowing someone sees you, really sees you, even when the world walks past. That mirror had become a kind of altar, not to fame or success, but to the moment everything shifted, the moment someone paused long enough to remind her she mattered. On the bottom shelf, tucked behind a row of writing anthologies, sat the napkin, yellowing now, creased at the corners but legible. "Please don't stop, the world needs your voice." She'd laminated it, unsure if the ink would fade with time. She hoped it wouldn't. But even if it did, the words were already carved somewhere deeper, in her heart, in her habits, in the space where self-doubt used to echo. Emily believed in symbols now. Mirrors, napkins, bookmarks left in libraries, notes scribbled in the back of borrowed novels. They were proof that the smallest gestures could shift the entire direction of a life. Her bookshelf wasn't just a collection of stories anymore. It was a map of how she found her way back to herself. Each book held a version of her. The girl who couldn't speak without shaking. The woman who taught herself to type through panic attacks. The friend who listened more than she shared. The author who walked into a bookstore one rainy afternoon and bumped into someone who didn't look away. She glanced again at the Matrix screenplay. It still sat upright, spine gently bent from being opened just once. The signature remained untouched. Like the man who gave it, present but never imposing. There was something poetic about its placement. That Matrix screenplay sat not at the center of the shelf, but slightly off to the right, flanked by two of Emily's own books, as if, even now, Keanu's presence made space for others to be seen, to be heard, to grow. She'd thought about moving it, centering it, even framing it, but it felt more honest this way, unassuming, yet deeply felt. Just like him. On quiet evenings, she sometimes sat on the rug with a cup of tea back against the wall, facing the shelf. She didn't always read. Sometimes she'd just look. Not at the titles, but at the mirror, at her own reflection. It used to make her flinch. Now it reminded her. You're still here. You kept going. You wrote through the fear. You made space for others. And someone, once upon a time, saw you when you didn't see yourself. There were messages scribbled now in her students' handwriting on sticky notes and index cards that occasionally appeared on her bulletin board. Your class changed me. Writing helps me breathe. I'm not afraid to speak anymore. These too were part of the shelf's story, not bound between covers, but just as powerful. Once, during a particularly rough week of deadlines and self-doubt, Emily had reached for her favorite pen, only to find a small folded piece of paper tucked into the drawer beside it. Ethan's handwriting. She smiled before even reading it. It said, "He saw you, so do I." She cried then, not because she was broken, but because she wasn't. Not anymore. Sometimes healing isn't loud. It doesn't always roar with applause or arrive with perfect closure. Sometimes it looks like a mirror beside your bookshelf. A single word etched into the glass. A voice you never knew was yours, finally echoing in someone else's story. That night, Emily lit a candle on the coffee table. A soft ritual she'd started when writing felt too hard. The flame danced, steady, present, like everything that had once been shaky in her life, finding its rhythm. She glanced once more at the mirror, then at the screenplay, then at the napkin. The house was silent, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full of echoes, of first steps and near exits and quiet kindnesses that changed the entire shape of a life. She whispered the words again, like a promise, like a prayer. "I'll keep writing." The room didn't reply. It didn't need to. It had already heard her. Keanu sat by the window, the late afternoon light casting a warm glow across the worn wooden table. In his hands was a book with a soft green cover. He ran his thumb along the spine slowly, carefully, as if it were something fragile. The title was simple, "The Margins of Her Voice." He turned the pages one by one, not rushing. Inside, he recognized the shape of her words, the softness, the strength she never saw in herself. And then, on the inside margin of page 73, in faint blue ink, was a note. "Thank you for waiting." He paused, reading it twice. Then he smiled. It wasn't big or showy. It was the kind of smile that carried weight, like he had been holding his breath for years, and now, finally, he could exhale. The room was quiet, only the occasional sound of a bird outside or the creak of the old chair as he shifted. He wasn't looking for cameras or applause. He wasn't even sure how the book had ended up in his hands again. All he knew was that he'd kept the napkin. And she'd kept her promise. He remembered that day at the bookstore, the startled look in her eyes, the hesitation, the trembling in her fingers when she handed him her notebook, and how she couldn't bring herself to ask for a photo, because the moment mattered more than the proof. He remembered what she wrote about later, how silence had shaped her world, how words had always lived inside her but never had space to breathe, and how one quiet moment with someone who didn't walk away helped unlock something buried. He traced her note again, letting the ink speak to something deeper. It wasn't about gratitude. It was about being seen. In another part of town, a young girl stepped into a bookstore for the first time in weeks. Her notebook was tucked close to her chest. She'd read the book 3 times. She didn't know the woman who wrote it, not really, but somehow it felt like the author knew her. Meanwhile, Keanu closed the book gently and leaned back. He didn't need to say anything. The words had already been spoken. The moment had already been shared. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting a golden warmth across the pages. He held the book for a while longer, then placed it gently on the table beside him. Next to it sat a napkin, the same one he had once scribbled a note on years ago. It was faded now, but the message remained. Please don't stop. The world needs your voice. The world always needed more quiet voices, he thought. The ones that didn't shout but carried weight. The ones that wrote in margins, who listened more than they spoke. People like her. And then came a moment of stillness. Sometimes, what we need most isn't advice. It isn't rescue. It's presence. And so we ask, have you ever been truly seen? What did that moment mean to you? Tell us below in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel a little less invisible. And if you have an idea for our next Keanu Reeves story, drop it in the comments too. We read every single one. This channel was built on stories from hearts like yours. Somewhere, another bookstore door opens. A new notebook is held close, and quietly the next story begins.